Hi, good morning. Mike Kerrigan, Leominster Historical Commission. And we're here at the Common at the Monument Square in Leominster. And we're going to be having a historical review of the Common in the last 175 years. There's a lot of history here, but I'll try to make it as brief and concise as possible to make it more interesting. This common was originally farmland back in the 1830s, 1820s for cattle and sheep. Leominster, of course, was agricultural for the first 150 years as a town. And the big year actually for the common was 1841. And that's when the first Congregational Church, Unitarian Universalists, sold to the town of Leominster over 1 acre of land here for the town common for slightly under $1,000. There was a special provision in the deed stating that no town buildings or then later city buildings to be built on the common. So just memorials and shrubs and trees can be on this common. And we have various memorials here that I just want to give you a brief history on. And we'll start with the Leominster Town Monument over there on our second meeting hall. And we'll walk over there now. Okay, this is the first monument I wanted to show. It was dedicated by the Leominster Historical Society, and it was crafted by John Yule. And this is where the site of the second meeting house was for the town of Leominster, the year of the Minutemen of Paul Revere and the battles of Lexington and Concord. 1775 was when this second meeting house was erected. The first meeting house was down by the Pine Grove Cemetery in the northwest section, which was built in 1741 as Leominster was now a town. And a lot of people with curiosity would probably want to know why the town would build their meeting house adjacent to a graveyard. And the old English colonists back in those days were very practical, and the meeting house was multi-purpose. It was a church, it was a meeting house, it was even a schoolhouse. So if there was a funeral, somebody had departed, they could actually have the funeral at the meeting house / church, and then bury the deceased not more than 200, 300 feet away. That practice continued until 1775, when the town decided to move its activity over here to where the present-day Monument Square and the Common are. And this townhouse is probably best remembered for July 15th of 1776. 10 days after the Declaration of Independence, a courier came up from Philadelphia and proclaimed the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And this declaration was read throughout the Massachusetts colony. And the town meeting house was used. The town folk of Leominster decided with a yay vote that they were going to accept the Declaration. Leominster was no longer inhabited by English colonists. We were now all Americans. And I believe the population of Leominster around there was about 950. And there is no real recordings of any family having been accused of being a Tory or being loyal to the Crown. It was a general feeling throughout Leominster that they would take up against the Crown, against the King of England. All right, this is a Civil War Veterans Memorial monument. It was originally out of the Monument Square. That's where Monument Square got its name. And it was erected in 1866 and dedicated in 1867. And there were 4 major battles during the Civil War that the town of Leominster participated in. And they're inscribed on the memorial, and each soldier that participated and passed is on the monument. And the most notable being, of which people can identify with, is Gettysburg, which Leominster had a critical part in the counterattack at Gettysburg on July 3rd. July 3rd of 1863 was probably the most pivotal day in American history. The Battle of Gettysburg had been 48 hours in the making, with no decisive outcome. And on the 3rd day of the battle, General Robert E. Lee decided to attack right through the very center of the Union line. And the 15th Massachusetts Regiment was comprised of men from Worcester County and from that of Leominster as well. And they held a position on the line probably not more than 800 feet from the center of the rebel advance. And the Confederates theorized that if they crashed through the center of the Union line, they could march on to Washington, D.C., 90 miles away, and pretty much dictate peace terms to President Lincoln. And the 15th Massachusetts Regiment had a Leominster man, Company A, Captain Hans Jorgensen. He was from Denmark, and he led the counterattack as the Union Pickett's charge. Pickett's division was virtually destroyed. About 70% of it was destroyed during the attack. But there was a Confederate brigade by Lou Armistead that did make it through the Union center, and with the counterattack, which the 15th Massachusetts Regiment was part of, the Confederate attack was repulsed, and that's where Captain Hans Jorgensen lost his life, along with many other Massachusetts veterans of the 15th Regiment. And as I mentioned, we have July 4th for the independence, but also July 3rd of 1863 was that one day that determined the actual outcome of the Civil War. But this monument was placed, I believe it stands 23 feet high, had been placed originally out in 1867 out in the Monument Square, and it stood there for over 100 years. And then on June 7th, 1984, the town of Leominster, in cooperation with the Urban Systems Renewal, moved the monument from the center over here into the common, where it's been standing and probably will ever stand. So, most of these men from the 15th Massachusetts Regiment participated with great valor that day at Gettysburg. And Hans Jorgensen is buried over at the Evergreen Cemetery right here in Leominster. Okay, hello again. This is back here on the common. The old Indian mortar that was donated by Whiting Gates in 1880 was found by Whiting Gates that year, a native Leominster resident, and donated to the Leominster Historical Society, and who gave the mortar stone to the common as a gift to the town, to the new city of Leominster. And this mortar stone was actually used to prepare meals for the Native Americans. The Nashaway tribe was the dominant Indian tribe living here in Montezuma region. The Nipmucks were further in southern Worcester County. But Leominster really never had Indian trouble. And all the Indian trouble was in Lancaster, which was mother town of Leominster. And in 1676, February 10th to be exact, the town of Lancaster was virtually wiped out by King Philip during King Philip's War. And 20 years later, Lancaster was resettled. And then in 1701, Chief George Tejano signed the new Lancaster Town Grant, which included the northern part of Lancaster, which of course is Leominster, and it went all the way to Winkichi Whalum, the shining waters of Lake Whalum, in the deed. And Chief George Tejano did not want war with the white settlers. He preferred peace, and the treaty was honored. And this is how Lancaster and Leominster were formed. And 39 years later, Leominster became its own township under the Houghtons. Unfortunately, the Nashway tribe is now extinct. They were killed by the English in some of the war of King Philip, and then a lot of them were pushed out west and up north into Vermont and New Hampshire. And the rest of them also intermingled as well. So there are no real traces of direct Nashway Indians left here in Leominster. A final legacy of them is the tribe back in the 16th, 15th centuries had settled on the river here, running through Fitchburg and Leominster, and I think you can correlate as to how the Nashua River got its name. The Nashways were hunters of deer, and they also did a lot of fishing. That's why they were on the banks of the Nashua River. And they also husked corn. They had the corn on the Indian mortarstone. So this is a tribute to the Native Americans that were in Leominster prior to the English colonists that came here in the very early 18th century. And the bottom of this monument is the actual cornerstone of the old town hall that burnt down in 1909, and the new city of Leominster decided to make a permanent memorial of it here on the common. So the memorial has two different meanings, but primarily it's a tribute to the Native Americans, and especially to a tribe that no longer exists. Thank you very much. And this here is the Spanish-American monument dedicated to the Spanish-American War of 1898 to actually 1902. It includes the Philippine insurrection and the China Relief Expedition. The Spanish-American War only lasted about 11 and a half weeks. The primary reason for the war, the United States in that year of 1898 was a growing world power, and the Spanish Empire that had been dominant over in the Western Hemisphere for almost 300 years was losing clout, and the Americans decided to show the Europeans who the new kid on the block was. And this USS Battleship Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor, and the Americans were at war with Spain. And as I mentioned, the campaign only lasted not even 12 weeks, and the Spanish government was forced to surrender Puerto Rico and the Philippines over to the United States. And in addition, Cuba was now being granted independent status. So this here is a monument to those that served on Leominster. And there was also the Philippine insurrection, because after the Americans took over the islands, the Filipinos wanted their own independence from the Americans, not only the Spanish. So this is how this monument came to be. As I had mentioned, it was a joint dedication ceremony with Bernard Doyle officiating, on November 11th, 1929. But now the Spanish-American veterans also have their own monument. And just like the World War I veterans of 1917, 1918, they also had their own monument. So each veterans group has been honored. Okay, we're here at the Veterans Monument, which honors the World War II, Korean, and Vietnam veterans here on the Common. This is dedicated on November 11th, 1973. The bell was donated by Jonas Henry Kendall. This bell was bought over in Boston in 1860. And for about 105 years it hung in the old town hall cupola, and when they took down the old town hall, this bell was eventually placed here in honor of all the veterans of the 20th century. Jonas Henry Kendall had a lot of money, philanthropist. He donated a lot of his time and money to the city of Leominster, to the town of Leominster at that time. Kendall Hall over in North Leominster is built by donations by Mr. Kendall, Jonas Kendall. But this is a permanent memorial monument, and it honors the well over 1,000 Leominster residents who served our country in World War II, and then the hundreds of the Korean era, and of course in Vietnam. And they dedicated the memorial circle down over by the Pine Grove and Carter Park as a further tribute to these veterans just 10 years ago. So, this monument, as I mentioned, is also perpetual. So all the wars that Leominster has been engaged with, these veterans are memorialized here on the Common forever. Okay, this is our World War Memorial Monument, and honored 30 Leominster names of Leominster City residents that gave their life in the service of their country. This monument was erected on November 11th, 1929. Simultaneously, there was a joint dedication ceremony the same day the Spanish-American monument was dedicated. So November 11th, 1929 was a big day for the Common, the city of Leominster. Mayor Bernard Doyle, he felt deeply moved and felt that both the veterans of the Spanish-American and the World War I veterans should have a dedication on the same day to make sure that all veterans were recognized. And this monument, again, was presented by John Yule, who was the owner of the Leominster Granite Company, and he is responsible for almost half the monuments in this Common. One tragic story about the names on this monument: almost half of them died of disease. They did not die in the trenches over in France fighting the Germans. Many of them were drafted. As a matter of fact, in 1917, the town of Leominster, now the city of Leominster, allowed the U.S. Armed Forces to have a recruiting tent over on the Park Street side of the Common, so young 18-year-old Leominster men could walk in and they could enlist, and probably within a couple months they were in basic training at the newly formed Fort Devens in Ayer, Massachusetts. And this, unfortunately, is right at the time, by 1918, when the Spanish flu epidemic hit, and the American soldiers in droves were dying from the flu epidemic, pandemic, what it actually was. But the soldiers that did go over to France, many of them, one of them, Albert Ewell, won the Silver Star, and others unfortunately were not only gassed, but then they were shot by the Germans. The city of Leominster had a big celebration in September of 1919 after the war had been ended. The armistice had been declared on November 11th, 1918. And with all the Leominster veterans home, Leominster had one of the biggest celebrations ever known. So this monument is going to be here, and it's a permanent memorial to the Leominster men who saw service. Our actual final monument here is this tablet that was dedicated by the Leominster Historical Commission in 2003. Don Pamarini and Chet Carter. And it just shows that the Monument Square is a historical district under the National Register of Historic Places from July of 1982. And it shows obviously the Common that I just gave a brief little tour of, and then various buildings throughout the Monument Square that are of historical value to the city of Leominster. And most of these buildings date back to around 1880 to 1900, but it does show that this square is indeed historic, and there will be a perpetual monument here for the city of Leominster.